Stop trying to trap reality in a box and call it understanding. Because the moment you try to contain something as vast as consciousness, life, awareness, the universe itself, you don't become the master of it. You become the player in its game. You think you're observing it from the outside, but you're inside the experiment. You're the container. And the container always gets shaped by what it tries to hold. Here's the punchline most people miss. The harder you squeeze reality into a neat explanation, the more it slips through your fingers. Not because you're not smart enough. Not because you need one more book, one more teacher, one more final answer. But because the very act of trying to control it changes your relationship to it. That's not just spiritual poetry. It echoes a real tension we see in physics. In quantum mechanics, measurement isn't a neutral act. Observation affects outcomes. The observer and the observed aren't cleanly separable in the way our ego loves to pretend. We want to stand outside the universe, like a scientist with a clipboard. But what if you're not outside anything? What if you're the universe trying to understand itself through a human nervous system? Some researchers are even taking that idea all the way to the edge. Dr. Maria Stroma, for example, has argued that consciousness may not be a late-stage byproduct of brains, but a foundational field, something woven into reality itself, potentially present before the Big Bang, shaping experience through processes comparable to symmetry breaking and quantum fluctuations. Let that land. If consciousness is fundamental, then you're not a person who has consciousness like a possession. You're consciousness wearing a person like a costume. Now watch what the ego does when it hears that. The ego says, okay, great, I'll control this too. I'll understand universal consciousness. I'll pin it down. I'll dominate the mystery. But the ego is not a wise king. It's a frantic manager. It's the part of you that thinks the only way to be safe is to be in charge. Douglas Youvaut describes the ego as a mediator between self-perception and reality, constantly negotiating, defending, editing the story so you can feel stable. The ego isn't evil. It's just terrified. And in its fear, it builds cages out of concepts, labels, identities, beliefs, roles, my truth, my path, my awakening, my control. And then it wonders why it still feels trapped. Because here's the twist. When you try to contain consciousness, it knows the shape you're forcing on it. Because that shape is you. Your expectations, your beliefs, your need to be right, your desperate demand for certainty. And universal consciousness, call it reality, call it awareness, call it the cosmos, doesn't obediently sit still. It responds, it plays, it reflects you back to you. So you look for the missing piece. You think, if I just find the one secret, one technique, one retreat, one breakthrough, then I'll finally feel whole. But what if the missing piece is the idea that there's a missing piece? That's the trap. The search becomes a self-hypnosis. Consciousness collapses into a single narrow point, your personal story, until you're locked inside a tiny room labeled me. And from inside that room, you keep knocking on the walls of the universe asking for freedom, while forgetting you're the one holding the key. This is what the perennial philosophy has been pointing to for centuries. That your true nature is not the separate, struggling self, but pure, unconditioned awareness. And the illusion of separateness is what keeps you confined. The observer versus observed split is the original hallucination. Once you buy into it, you spend your life trying to get back to unity by collecting more separation, more achievements, more control, more understanding, more proof. And it never ends, because there will always be something more to understand, when the one doing the understanding is the very thing being understood. Now here's the way out, and it's not what your ego wants to hear. The only hope isn't out there. It's within. Not within as a poetic concept, within as an actual shift of attention. Instead of trying to dominate the mystery, you turn around and look at the one who's trying so hard to dominate. You inquire into the I that claims it's trapped. You get curious about the voice that insists, I must control this. You stop chasing consciousness as an object, and you recognize yourself as the space in which all objects arise. Some traditions call the deep end of this recognition Thuriya Titha, beyond the fourth, a state where individual consciousness dissolves into a unified field, where knowing isn't something you do, it's something you are. Not because you've accumulated more concepts, but because you've released the grip that needed concepts to feel real. So let me ask you directly, how long are you going to keep tightening the lid? How long will you keep trying to contain the infinite and calling that containment wisdom? If you're ready to stop shadowboxing the universe, do this. Pause. Breathe. And for just 10 seconds, notice the awareness that's already here. Before your next thought, before your next label, before your next attempt to figure it out. That awareness isn't missing. You are not broken. You don't need the final piece. You need to stop outsourcing yourself to the search. And if this hit something in you, if you felt that quiet yes underneath the noise, follow it. Go inward. Ask better questions. Practice real self-inquiry. Because the moment you stop trying to contain consciousness, you remember you were never separate from it in the first place.